I like to make myself laugh, when I'm writing. I mean, I think it's very important. I mean, especially, when you're writing about very grim and horrible things, as I often am.
I'd like you to talk about the power of a good story. That reminded me here in Denmark about Hans Christian Andersen.
Yes, of course.
He has a very, very well-known story called The Emperor's New Clothes, story of the naked emperor. You know, it's quoted anywhere if you want to criticize power or the ignorance of power. The funny thing is that he thought it was a European folk tale that he rewrote. But it has traveled for more than 1,000 years from India.
Really?
Yes, it's an Indian story, more than 1,000 years old. It's known in giant sources. So I guess that's a good example of a powerful story.
Storytelling is in some way India's national vocation, and has always been. I mean, Indian stories, India, India live in a world of stories. And the oldest Indian stories have been so incredibly powerful. Most of all, if you look at the great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, I mean, their influence upon the world is almost inconceivable. I mean, the Iliad and the Odyssey are great stories, wonderful stories, but they don't enter into people's everyday lives, in the way that the Mahabharata and the Ramayana do. I mean, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are constantly enacted and reenacted, and not just in India, in Burma, in Thailand, in Indonesia, in Cambodia. So these stories have an incredible power. I mean, they sort of explain people's everyday lives, give meaning to people's everyday lives. But these are, of course, the best known stories. But there are many other stories. The Jataka stories of the of the Buddhists, the Katha Sarit Sagar. The ocean of stories, and all these stories. They were in circulation since antiquity. So Aesop's fables are very much influenced by Indian stories. The Thousand and One Nights are very much influenced by Indian stories. So as stories have been, in some interesting way, really India's national vocation. But let's say when I was a young man, Indian stories continue to be very powerful in so many parts of the world. I mean, if you traveled in the Middle East and North Africa, uh, people would always, relate to you through Indian films. Indian films were so popular. In Indonesia, everything would come to an absolute standstill, when the Mahabharata and the Ramayana were being shown. But that has changed now. I think, that kind of Indian storytelling no longer has that much of a place in the world.
And you also use or represent multiple voices, multiple language, even non-human voices lately.
Well, in India, we all grow up being very, very multilingual. So I think we are all accustomed to dealing with multiple voices, multiple languages. And this is a sort of historically a very important aspect of Indian literature, going back to antiquity, going back to classical times. A lot of Indian theorizing about aesthetics is exactly about how to handle multiple voices. So I think you can't, it's very difficult to write about India in a single language because, almost every Indian speaks one language at home, another language outside, another language in school. So, we grow up with this kind of, with this multilingualism within us. But certainly, I would say that of within the last 10 years, 10, 15 years, uh, what's become very important for me is this idea of trying to find ways to give voice to non-human actors, because that's something that literature did historically. Before 1750, it's very hard to find any narrative that doesn't include animals, you know, natural forces, gods, demons, saints, etc. Well, just think of the Odyssey or the Iliad. They're just so full of, there are gods, there are speaking animals, there are, you know, there are just so many kinds of non-human agencies. But even apart from that, I mean, if you take, I mean, even people who were, let's say, writing histories of, let's say, Iceland or Norway. I mean, at some point within the narrative, they'll say, "Oh, and then there were these elves running across," you know. So, or there'll be fairies or whatever. So all sorts of things get drawn in, or there are saints who are doing miraculous things, or there are angels, demons, of course. So, pre-modern writing was very aware of many different kinds of potentiality in the world that we live in. And I think it's very important to try and work our way back to finding that.
Some years back, you said that stories about climate change, climate collapse, the limits of the planet were sort of referred to second-rate literature of sci-fi and climate fiction and so on. Has that changed?
Let me say to begin with that there's a lot more writing about these issues now than there was 10 years ago. I mean, I know from personal experience because almost every day I get a manuscript from someone saying, your book inspired me, so now you have to read my book, which is of course impossible. How can I do that? But it's very much the case that it's, these things have really opened up a lot. A lot more is being written. But again, I would say that, it's not that writers were not writing about these subjects. They were. They've been writing about these subjects for a long time. The problem is with the broader ecosystem of literature, with publishing houses, with reviewers, with magazines. And there, I would say that there hasn't been that great a change, which is very unfortunate, because the really unfortunate thing is that, the world of the arts, which is meant to be so bohemian and avant-garde, actually it's very conservative, profoundly conservative. I mean, after all, who are the people who run publishing houses? They're all very highly educated, usually men, who've been trained in, in classical stuff, So when they think of what is a good story, the idea for them is Pride and Prejudice, not so much Moby Dick even, but, So that's what they want to see, on the page. I mean, they have a certain idea of how literature should work. And that's what they want to see reproduced. So I would say that even now, in the major reviews, magazines, etc., there's very little discussion of the new writing that's being done. Even though the writing is very much there, that writing continues to be, as it were, sidelined within a certain genre,
So just ending on where I started, the power of a good story. A very powerful story is the story of progress, evolution.
I was just sent a book by Samuel MacDonald Miller, a very interesting writer, and the book is called Progress. Progress, and the subtitle is The Worst Idea That Humans Have Ever Had, or something along those lines. And it's absolutely true. This idea of progress was used to justify slavery, colonialism, the killing of, literally millions of people. I mean, it's absolutely just one of the worst ideas that's ever existed. And yet, it continues to occupy such a large part of our minds, So when we think of what we think of as good politics or policies or whatever, we use the word progressive, you know, when in fact, we should be thinking of something else. Ooh, the dog is drinking the coffee.